also. So I'm kind of depending on you not remembering everything from last time. All right, which is probably bad assumption with the Ole group. They sharp intellects. All right. Okay. So let's start with one of the world's best food and biochemistry successes. This is a product that is called a therapeutic food, and it is called Plumpy-Nut. When I was doing some research, there was a short little thing in the internet about, at one point, Hillary Clinton, while she was Secretary of State, it sent in one of her thousands of emails, said, "What the heck is Plumpy-Nut, and why should I know?" Well, it's because Plumpy-Nut has been considered by some to be a life-saving medical intervention equal to that of penicillin. And what it is for is feeding malnourished children. So there are, of course, hundreds of thousands, millions of malnourished children, and when they get really seriously malnourished, they are very difficult to treat. In other words, even if you get them to a clinic, the old ideas would be, well, you would feed them milk, because babies and small children can feed milk, but milk has to be refrigerated. If they're really malnourished, they don't digest it very well. And somebody, a French company, came up with this food source. Now what it is, basically, the core of it is peanut butter. And it also has some vegetable oil, some powdered milk, some sugar, vitamins, and minerals. And it's really quite tasty. So you can put it in these packages, can be stored at room temperature, will last 2 years, cost about 50 cents, and children really like the taste and will eat it on their own. And they find that just taking severely malnourished kids, they'll have a 90% recovery rate with this Plumpy-Nut. So I use this as an opening story because it's an interesting question of what's in here and why is it so good. And it's basically something that tastes good, can be stored, and yet it's got your major ingredients. It's got your sugars, your lipids, the fats, and your proteins, and that's supplemented with the vitamins and minerals that the person needs. All right, so what we're going to do in this course primarily is kind of look just a little bit at the chemistry of what are these basic nutrients and how do we take them up, how do we get energy out of them. So let's start with what do we absolutely have to have in our food. So if you look at bacteria, bacteria can grow on almost nothing. So they need a lot of just simple salts, simple elements. So this is sodium phosphate, potassium phosphate, ammonium, sodium, magnesium, sulfate, calcium. And then they have to have some source of energy. They have to have some source of molecules, atoms, to build the parts of the cell. And for a simple bacteria, you can do that just by giving them one simple sugar, like glucose. Glucose is just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they can make everything else. And this bacterium E. coli, which is kind of the most widely studied laboratory organism in the world probably, is not that simple an organism. It has about 4,000 genes. And so an E. coli cell has about 4,000 different kinds of molecules, but it can make them from just these basic ingredients. All right. Now, what about people? All right. So one way to find out if our cells are different in some ways is to see what you need to grow human cells in culture. So it's been known for a long time that you can grow little bits of yourself in a glass dish. You could take a little chunk out of your finger, put it in the appropriate medium in a petri dish, and then see what you would have to feed it to get these cells to grow and divide. Now, and what has come out of this is that human cells need quite a bit more than those bacterial cells. They cannot make everything. but they don't need all that many things. It's interesting. The essential nutrients to grow a human cell is really a list of about 60 items. So they need some source of energy, some sort of core food. And so you can use a sugar, glucose, a simple sugar. And the next lecture, we're going to go into a little bit what makes a sugar. What do they look like? You need the components of proteins. So proteins are made out of amino acids. And if you want to grow these cells in cultures, you typically have to add all 20, although only 10 of them are absolutely essential. We can convert some of these 10 to the other 10 to make them. Now, purines, pyrimidines, nucleotides, this is what DNA is made out of, A, C, T, and G. A's, C's, T's, and G's are just the names for different types of nucleotides. And they come in two alternative structures. One structure is called the purines, and the other structure is called the pyrimidines. And we'll look at this a little bit in the future, too. Then you need components of the membrane of the cell. So choline, inositol, these are very small molecules. And they're made up, they are used to make this sort of fatty, oily layer that is the boundary of all cells and is also makes the structure of the little compartments inside the cell. We need 8 vitamins. Well, what are vitamins anyway? We're going to come to that. This is something that's almost like a vitamin, lipoic acid, long complex molecules, essential for a few reactions. There are a number of salts that you need. These you need in fairly high concentrations. These you need in just trace amounts. And often you don't even have to add these to make the cells grow because almost everything else is contaminated with just a little bit of these elements. And they need so few atoms that they get in there. So it all comes to a list of about 60 things that our cells have to survive. Now I should say that if you actually grow cells in culture on this totally defined medium, just chemicals off the shelf, they grow, but they're not very happy. They don't grow very well. All right. So that's kind of the absolute minimum for survival. What typically they will do to grow cells in culture is they'll use the fluid from blood. You get blood and you use a centrifuge to spin out all the red blood cells and the white blood cells, and you just use the remaining fluid. There's no living organisms in it. And what is in that serum? That's what they're using, serum from blood. And what's in there? And the answer is there's a lot of stuff in there. Probably thousands of different kinds of molecules. And so, in addition to this, you also need what are called micronutrients, things that are required in very tiny quantities for the cells to really thrive. And in a way, when we think about food and diet, this is kind of addressing our fundamental nutritional needs, and that is, there are very few things we need. Can you survive off of peanuts and Oreos? Yes, but you won't thrive. Okay. All right. And it's probably because of all these micronutrients. There are just things that we need in very small quantities, but we need them to grow really in a healthy manner. Okay. And let me say also that I'm happy to have you interrupt me at any time for questions. Questions at this point here? Yes.
When you say micronutrients, are you talking about trace elements?
Some micronutrients are trace elements, but really, more generally, when they use that term, these are more complex molecules. In cells in culture, some of them are hormones, signaling molecules like this that are controlling cell division. Yeah. Okay. So, of our periodic table of the elements up here, a lot of this stuff we don't really need. You know, you can make a human being largely 99% of it, well, not 99, maybe 95% of us is really just these 3 types of atoms: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of chemistry right now. This is going to be the chemistry part of your biochemistry, because after all, we are, in the end, just made up of atoms, and we need to know we'll combine with 3 hydrogens, and what you get is ammonia. It has this stoichiometric ratio, 1 to 3, because that's what's needed to make 8 electrons out here. Carbon needs 4. And the fact that it needs 4 means that carbon can combine potentially with 4 different atoms, or 3, or 2, depending how many electrons the other atom is contributing. So, if you take 4 hydrogens and 1 carbon, you get CH4. This is methane gas. This is a gas produced by oil wells in your intestines. That's a major greenhouse gas also. Okay, oxygen, the one I'm emphasizing here, needs 2 electrons. And this is why these very abundant atoms in the atmosphere can get together in a ratio of 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, so that this 6 plus 2 makes 8, and that gives us one of the most abundant molecules on Earth, hydrogen, H2O. So, this key point here explains much of the biochemistry of cells, and that is oxygen has a very high affinity. It wants 2 electrons to complete its outer shell, and it will combine with other atoms to do this. Okay.
Makes water, not hydrogen.
Okay, makes water, right. Okay, so here is a more complex, but for a nutritional molecule, relatively simple one. This is the atomic structure of glycine. And glycine is an amino acid. This NH is an amine group. This is NH2 is an amine. This N here can be an acid, so it's called an amino acid. And that's what you make protein out of. Long strings of these amino acids, anywhere from 10 to 10,000 amino acids in a string, are used to make proteins, and we're going to spend some time later talking about proteins. But this illustrates all this bonding scheme here. So nitrogen needs 3 electrons to fill its outer shell. So it gets 1 from a hydrogen, 1 from a hydrogen, and 1 from a carbon. Carbon needs 4. So carbon bonds to a hydrogen, a nitrogen, a hydrogen, and another carbon. This carbon needs 4 too, so it gets 1 from carbon, 1 from this oxygen, and it shares a pair with the oxygen. See, so these are happy here because oxygen wants to share 2 more. This carbon needs to share 2 more to contribute to the 1, 2, 3, 4 that it needs, so it all works out. And this oxygen needs 2, so it shares 1 of them with the carbon and 1 of them with the hydrogen. I remember when I was in high school, being taught this for the first time, I thought, gee, that makes sense. All right, okay. So it's the basic stoichiometric arrangement of how atoms go together and how many atoms will bind to how many other atoms. All right. So really, this is about as deep as we're going to go into this. All right. Questions about this? But it's very useful to see the basic structure of the sugars, the proteins, the lipids, and to see that it sets limits on what kind of molecular arrangements you can get when you put different atoms together. Okay. So let's now turn to more complicated things. So one of the major points I want to make about food is that almost all of our food really comes from eating cells. All right. And the reason that's a good thing is that our own cells are very complicated. We have about 25,000 different kinds of molecules in our cells. And how do we make sure we get the right nutrients. And the best way is to eat somebody else's cells, all right? And we either eat plant cells, generally, or we eat animal cells, all right? And those two kinds of cells, plant and animal cells, are very similar at their molecular level, and so they're in most ways very similar at their nutritional level. So, I mean, can you survive by just eating plant cells? Well, yes. People are vegetarians. Happens a lot. Can you survive just by eating animal cells? I mean, does anybody really eat no veggies? And the answer is, well, think of the Inuit living in Greenland or Alaska. They may go months and not have anything that's green, or did for tens of thousands of years. So how do they do that? And the answer is, they eat an animal that ate something green. All right. All right. So in fact, I mean, if you're an Inuit living in a very polar climate, where do you get your vitamins from? And if you eat sort of like raw fat from marine mammals, they're really a very nutritious, vitamin-rich thing, because those marine mammals are eating other creatures that are eating plants down the line. Okay. So a major distinction really between plant and animal cells is that if you look in a typical a plant cell will look like this, and it will have this big central vacuole. It's got a large space that's really just water. But there is a layer in the cell that has the nucleus and all of these subcompartments and is loaded with protein, etc. So plant cells are very complete in what they provide, all right, but they're a lot more watery cells. And you can just picture by thinking any kind of vegetable and looking at, or even some fruits, and think of what is it like if you buy it freeze-dried, and you know, most of the mass just disappears. So excellent in quality, but if you're eating typical lettuce or whatever, you just have to eat a ton to survive. All right, animal cells, on the other hand, don't have these large central vacuoles. They're not quite so watery inside, if you will. And so animal cells, you know, kind of pound for pound, have a lot more nutrients in them because they don't have just as much water. Now, a major distinction, though, is that most animals that we eat, like ourselves, really require a lot of vitamins and other nutrients that they cannot synthesize within themselves. So a pure animal diet can be deficient in certain vitamins. I mean, animals ultimately live by eating plants. Plants, however, can grow on basically air and dirt, and the reason they can do that is because they have the capacity to make everything they need. I mean, higher plants are even better than bacteria because you don't even have to give them glucose. All you've got to give them is air, carbon dioxide, and oxygen, and the minerals, salts that are in the soil. And so, how do they pull this off? What's the extra ingredient?
Sunlight.
Sunlight, of course. Right, sunlight. That's where they get their energy. Okay. So, let's look at kind of what might be inside a typical cell that we would use as food, if we could really see all the components. Now, this is a computerized view, a computerized drawing of what the inside of a cell would look like if we drew all of the molecules in there to be the correct size. So this is just showing one part of a cell. What this layer here is the nucleus of the cell. This is inside the nucleus, and this is out here in the cytoplasm. So if we had a typical cell, it would have this big outer layer, and then inside here would be this nucleus, which has this double membrane like this.
Can you use a darker pen?
This one is black, actually. So what we're looking at right here is just like this little piece of a cell. Okay. So that it's a small enough region that you can almost see individual molecules. And what you find is that the typical cell has, the most abundant thing in here, of course, is water. But besides proteins. So these, like these little green dots here, these little yellow ones, these little blue ones, these are all kind of typical proteins. Now, just to get some sense of scale, so, you know, this is the whole cell, and we're looking at a little piece of this cell. This is a very large molecule of protein, and probably the question was how many atoms would be in a typical protein, just to put it in a proper scale. All right, so what would your vote be? What would be a typical, the number of atoms? Would it be 1,000? A million? Probably in the answer would probably be something like about 100,000. 100,000 roughly. Typical protein's going to have 500 amino acids, and every amino acid is going to have about 10 atoms. So they vary a lot, but like 100,000. But the point is that even this, which is a tiny structure, is giant in terms of the molecular world, because it is made up of about 100,000 different carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen atoms in it. All right, and most of what you see is protein. All right, there will be inside the cell, actually in terms of carbohydrates, not very much at all. I mean, we think of sugars as a big component of our diet, but in fact most cells don't have many sugars. They're going to be kind of decorating, there are going to be some sugars sticking out on a few of the proteins, but actually most of those tend to be outside the cell, not inside the cell. And there will be some sugar sort of floating around here in the water to be used as a food supply. All right, but it is probably the least abundant of the major categories in the cell. Then there's going to be the fats, the lipids, and that's what these tan lines here. So the fats will tend to congregate together, and within the cell, the type of fatty molecules that we have form this bilayer. They're two molecules thick. There's one that forms lines up on the outside, and one that lines up on the inside. Because you think if you pour water into if you pour oil into a pot of water, it doesn't dissolve. It just floats to the top. Oil associates with other oil. That's what happens inside the cell. So there's no water in this mix at all. It's just a layer of oil, really. All right. One thing the diagram doesn't do very correctly is that these membranes are not just pure fat and oil. They're actually more than 50% made up of protein. So, for example, there's a little place here where they're showing a protein embedded within the membrane. If you were showing it accurately, there'd be almost more protein poking through this layer of oil than the oil itself. And then lastly, the other thing you find in the cell is there's the genes, which is the DNA, and the whole part of the way the genes are expressed through RNA, etc. And that's what's shown down here in these blue molecules. These are DNA molecules. So nutritionally, when you look on the back of a food package, it'll tell you how much fat, how much sugar, how much protein is there, but it never tells you how much DNA is there. For one thing, Would you eat the genes of other organisms? Well, you don't have any choice. All right, of course. You eat them all the time. All right, you're always eating other people's genes. All sorts of weird genes. Not other people's genes, but other organisms' genes. All right. What the nutritionists do is they usually they lump the DNA molecules in with the carbohydrates, because they're, even though they're not really sugars, but nutritionally that's where they go. And typically they're well under 5% of these kind of the total quantity of different kinds of molecules in any particular cell.
Yeah, if you're looking at this under a microscope, what would be the real colors you would see?
So it would be transparent. In fact, you would, in the best microscope in the world, you would not be able to see this at all.
Oh.
So to really be able to see it, you have to do one of two things. One is you have to fix it, which means kind of embed it, basically get rid of the water, and often do something like add a metal that will coat the proteins and coat the things in here. And the metal will either deflect the light rays or the electrons, and so you'll be able to see it as a series of shadows. But in the last few years, and those of you who've taken the molecular biology course have seen some of these pictures, we now have a way of making all of these molecules such that we attach to them molecules that are colored. Red ones, green ones, now we can make everything. And so you can see where any given protein is in the cell and how much it is there, because you can make it colored and actually visible in the microscope. Even that, though, technically it's not as good as I just said. It doesn't actually allow you to see one protein molecule. They're just too small. But you can see clusters, and you can see, for example, if there was some protein that was present in the nucleus but not out here, and you put a green tag on the one in the nucleus, the whole nucleus would glow green. You wouldn't be able to see the individual molecules, but you say, oh, that I know that one now is inside the nucleus. But that's actually a technically challenging problem, the fact that even with the best microscopes, we can't really look at it this way. It's just too small to see. Okay, other questions? All right. So, the cells I just showed you, though, in a way, that's what happens if if you're eating lettuce or broccoli or insects or whatever, or you're eating the whole organism. But that's not where we get most of our food from. We really get most of our food from these very highly specialized cells. Cells that the organism has specialized to store nutrients. So, the main place we get our food from are the seeds of plants. Alright, so rice, corn, wheat, peanuts, rapeseed, these are some of the major food crops of the world. Alright, and one important thing to think about when you're thinking about kinds of farming, growing food, what we need, etc., that 80% of all human calorie intake really comes from these three crops: rice, corn, wheat. The kind of place where this information becomes useful is, we see lots of kind of innovations in agriculture, etc. A big thing right now is like these really high-intensity greenhouse operations people have. And you see stories about maybe we could convert, urban settings to just rooftop gardens. And you see these lush greenhouses which is filled with greenery in them. Well, there is some advantage to that. There are two questions. First of all, those tomatoes grown in there can be very expensive tomatoes because it's just the infrastructure of it. But you don't see anybody growing wheat in those greenhouses, or corn, or rice. And yet that's where most of the calories come from. So any good answer to where we're going to get our food from has to address the issue of you just got to produce a lot of calories somehow. And that is just those hundreds of millions of acres of cropland that we see around the world. All right. Then the other major place we get our food, and this is from highly specialized cells that are storing a lot of nutrients. And that is in animals, you know, the parts that we eat are generally just the muscle. You think of something like chicken, a lot of the calories in the chicken are in the skin and the fat just under the skin. And then another very important source of nutrients, often they will say you can get this from liver. Now why the liver? Well, because that's the organ, that's the food processing organ in all creatures. So those vitamins that you need to cause the metabolic reactions to go, the place they're needed in your body is in your liver, because that's where you're doing all the processing of the food you took in. And so one shortcut to get the vitamins you need is to eat the liver of some other creature. All right? The liver is going to have a lot more vitamins than the fat cells, because the fat cells aren't doing that much metabolism for hard times. But the liver has a great deal of biochemical complexity because it's doing all of the processing job. All right. So the kind of bottom line here is that it's really important to eat things like lettuce and broccoli, etc., because they're so nutritionally rich. Those are just cells that have 20,000 different kinds of molecules in it. But to get the calories, we tend to eat much simpler types of cells, cells that are really specialized in storing large amounts of a few kind of nutrients, like fats or sugars. Okay. All right, so what I want to do next, you may remember this from last time. Let's look, here we are, McDonald's, the golden arches. Okay, and I have brought in a typical part of the American diet, a Big Mac. This is a real Big Mac. And for you who took the course last time, you know, I always have to say at the beginning, this is not going to be some McDonald's diatribe, you know, why you should never eat this. But I used to work at McDonald's when I was 18 and 19, I think. I worked at McDonald's in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Right? And this is still when they didn't have an outside to it. We just had the window and you came up in your car. Started out back as the bun boy and worked my way up to the front window. All right. All right. So this is actually, you know, perfectly reasonably good food. You just shouldn't eat it 2 times a day. Well, if you have a Big Mac every couple of weeks, perfectly fine for you. Just eat a variety of other things in the middle. So what I want to do is, and I do this because I found over the years of teaching biochemistry to students here at UCSC, that this would get them a little bit interested, you know. Because, all right, so we have here the Big Mac bun. All right, so you're all biochemists. So what is this to a biochemist? What's it made out of? And what is in here? So carbohydrate. That's right. Okay, so if you go to McDonald's website, you can get a list of exactly what they used to make the Big Mac bun. All right, and here I have it. All right, so a lot of things in this. So let's take a look at just exactly what's in here. All right, so the way these ingredient labels usually work is there are rules for it. They're supposed to put they're supposed to put it in order of abundance. So the most abundant molecules in the food are put first, and then it's decreasing order of abundance. So the major thing in here is enriched bleached wheat flour. Okay, and biochemically, what molecule is that? Sugar. Not quite yet, but it's a form of sugar. It's starch. All right. So it's chains of sugar molecules. That's right. So wheat is a seed, and its function in life is to provide energy to a new growing plant, and that energy is provided in a stored form as starch. Now, it's enriched flour. Okay. So what is it enriched in? Okay. And so now we have these molecules here: thymine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, folic acid. Well, we know what iron is, all right, that's an element, and we know that we need iron to make the hemoglobin in our blood. But besides that, we need iron for every cell in our body, because where it really has its essential role is in capturing, holding this highly reactive molecule that drives everything else, which I mentioned earlier, is oxygen. So iron is a major binder, presenter, holder of oxygen in all cells, in all organisms. Okay. But what are these other molecules? So you often see them, and the answer is that they are vitamins. Okay. What's a vitamin? Okay, so this is a good definition. Any of a group of organic compounds. Now, I'm using the organic word here as chemists would use it. So, an organic molecule is one that contains carbon. Actually, Todd, is it defined? Not all carbon molecules are organic molecules, right?
That's right.
So, do you remember how to distinguish the organic from non-organic carbon? Like if you had carbon sulfide, that's not a carbon.
Well, it's molecules that make up living things.
Yeah, okay. Right, right. So it has nothing to do with organic agriculture. It's really a class of molecules harvested from living creatures that contain carbon. All right, and vitamins are essential for normal growth. You have to have them to survive. They're required in small quantities in the diet because they cannot be synthesized by the body, by humans, and by most animals, most large animals. So, in the Big Mac bun, in order of abundance, we see this one, thiamine. And this is what thiamine looks like. Relatively simple, but it has these two ring molecules. It has some nitrogens in it. Otherwise, it's your basic carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And you don't remember from your chemistry, when they show these complex ring molecules, to make the diagram simpler, they don't show the carbons. But where these bonds join, there's a carbon, 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 carbon. So they leave out the carbons in the skeleton of the molecule. But carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Now, this is relatively simple, but you can see that if you were to make this molecule in the lab, starting with just simple sugars or something, it would take you many steps. You have to maybe construct this ring, then add this CH3 group, then add this amino group, then you have to construct this ring. It's got a couple of double bonds in it. You've got to put them together. And really, if you went and looked into the plant that has all the chemical steps, all the chemical enzymatic machines necessary to make this, that's probably at least a 20-step process. So, in the evolution of humans and other animals, cells have essentially stopped making all of those kinds of proteins needed to do those 20 steps, and instead just eat plants to get the molecule. So the reason we think that we can't make that is because there's a real energetic cost to making all of the machinery needed to make tiny amounts of this molecule. So we just lost those genes, we just eat plants. All right. And so that is true for a lot of our essential nutrients. Now, it's one of the vitamin A, B, C, D, E, that naming is often quite confusing And it really doesn't have any kind of scientific logic to it. It is more historical than anything else. In other words, one of the first vitamins was called A, and then the second one was called B and C. And so one of the ones looked a lot like the second one, so they called it vitamin B2, etc. So they don't really fall into neat categories. It's a historical naming convention for the vitamins. Now, how did they find these in the first place? Well, as with a lot of basic biochemistry, it really came about from studying disease. So they found that people had this nutritional deficiency, beriberi. And the symptoms of that is just a general wasting disease. It's sort of like if you don't get vitamin C, what's the one I'm thinking? Scurvy, you know. The general symptoms are somewhat similar. And it was found that people who had this disease were eating a diet that had almost no thiamine in it. And just the deficiency in this one type of molecule was a failure to thrive, and it could be lethal deficiency. You simply cannot do the metabolic processes you need to take your food and convert it to cells in your own body without this molecule. All right, and there are several metabolic steps that require it. Now, you can get it now, however, if you're eating cereal grains, that's a good source. It's essential for metabolizing sugars. All right, riboflavin, this is called vitamin B2. You see it actually has a structure that's much different from thiamine. You have this 3 fused rings. Again, these are all carbon molecules with this little tail on it. And the fact is that a very low red blood cell count. So you get anemia. And so good sources of this are vegetables, all right, because they can make it. But you can also get it from milk and liver. Why? Because if you're eating cow liver, the cow is eating grass. It's getting the riboflavin from the grass and keeping it in large amounts in its liver. And the cow also knows that to feed its calf, it's going to need to feed it vitamins. And so some of that riboflavin that came from the plant is delivered to the milk in the cow. So ultimately it comes from the plant. It's just you can bypass it by eating a cow liver. All right, and this has a central role in energy metabolism, and I'm going to go into that next time when we talk about energy metabolism. The other couple of vitamins that were listed there, niacin, relatively simple molecule here. And this is another nutritional disease that occurs if you don't get enough niacin, and it's pellagra. So, if you're on a diet that you're eating mostly corn, it turns out that corn is good for most of the nutrients you need, but it's deficient in this one vitamin. And so people are eating pure corn diets, not eating veggies or other things with it. Well, they might have plenty of calories, but they lack this essential molecule, and it is required to metabolize the starch that they're getting from the corn. So they're getting the food, but they don't have the processing machinery because they're missing a key chemical molecule that's required for that processing machinery. And then folic acid, gotten a lot of attention in the last few years because it's found now to be associated with some birth defects, so deficiency of folic acid during pregnancy. So you get that out of vegetables. Liver again, deficiency causes anemia, and specifically it's linked to development of the nervous system in kind of fetal development. So for each of these, we now know exactly where in the cell the vitamin is required. So folic acid, just to give you a chemical specific reaction here, there's this group of 4 atoms here, a carbon and 3 hydrogens. It's called a methyl group. And to put a methyl group on some other molecule requires a protein that has, as part of its working center, a molecule of folic acid. And you can see this is a very complex molecule, so to make this, which the plants can do, requires probably 20 different genes, which are making 20 different enzymes. And in our evolution, we just said, forget it, we'll just eat the plants. Okay, question?
What does folic acid do to the plant?
So the plants, this is an amino acid in protein. They need to make this amino acid to make the protein in the plant. And so they need the folic acid to put the methyl groups on this. So it's part of the reason why the plants can grow out of air, because they can make everything else. But the other side of that, it means that they have to make all of these vitamins from scratch. So it makes the point that I've often emphasized in teaching, that we think of plants as primitive, but biochemically plants are way more sophisticated than we are. They can do everything we can do, and then a whole bunch of additional reactions on top of what we can do.
We evolved to move around,
Mm-hmm.
the whole animal world, and so we're busy moving around and using our energetics to do that. Plants are stationary.
Mm-hmm.
They'll grow, but is it that they have the ability to have this much work going on in the plant because they're not using it to get around?
That's right. They can't go and find a food source.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to be able to make everything from scratch.
Right, but they're
Yeah.
also still. They're not using their energies
Right.
to get from here to San Jose.
They don't have a brain either, I presume. You know, so we use an awful lot of energy supporting that.
Well, that's right. So that's part of. I'm sort of getting your question now. Right. So part of the reason why we feel the need to be more efficient is because we're using the energy that we otherwise would have devoted to making the 20 enzymes that we needed to make this thing. We're using that to power our muscles or to power our whole nervous system. That's right. Yeah. Okay, so continuing on here with the Big Mac. So, there's water in it, and then high fructose corn syrup. Boo, right? Okay. All right, you look that stuff up, and it's poison. Well, next week we're going to look at this, and the answer is, it's just plain old sugar. Okay, it's just a cheap source of sugar. All right, we'll talk about how it's made and such. All right, then there's all of this stuff down here that, what in the world is this stuff? Anyway, mono and diglycerides. Well, then here, diacetyltartaric acid ester of mono and diglycerides. Ethoxylated mono and diglycerides. What are these diglycerides? Well, here's the structure of a diglyceride down here. So, these 3 carbons here, each of which have an OH sticking out. This is glycerol. Glycerin. You know, you could eat it. It's sweet. It's called a sugar alcohol. All right. And it's, you know, a kind of syrupy molecule. Its important role in cells is that it forms the kind of core structure to which fats are linked. So, we're going to talk about fats in the future, but their structure is extremely simple. You just got a row of carbons, and each one forms 4 bonds, either to another carbon or to hydrogen. So if we just look at just this molecule itself, all right, that is hydrocarbon. That is what you put in your car. All right, that is gasoline. Exact same molecule. All right. Okay, so you can take these lipid molecules, hydrocarbons, all right, and attach them. If you attach 2 of them to a glycerol, you get a diglyceride. If you attached only 1, it would be a monoglyceride. If you attach 3, it would be a triglyceride. All right. So what these are then are really just basic different forms of fat. They are naturally occurring molecules. This is the type of molecule that makes the membranes that we saw in that cartoon of the innards of the cell. All right. Okay. Now, so we go through, that's what the bun is. Then we get the real working part of the Big Mac. Oh, all right, here. It's the patty. 2 all-beef patties. All right. So, and they're here. They have the description is quite simple. 100% USD inspected beef. No additives, no fillers, no extenders. Okay, that's all good. So, this, however, if they had the ingredient list, would have about 25,000 things in it. All right. Because the cow that makes this has about 25,000 genes. Each of those genes makes a protein which is involved in the synthesis or degradation of some molecule. So the reason that is a good nutrient is because that is where all the micronutrients and all of the little extra things we need come from. All right. Then there is the secret ingredient, the Big Mac sauce. All right. Again, in order of abundance. So the most abundant thing, soybean oil. So it's fat. All right. Then there are some pickles in it, some vinegar. This is a simple molecule. Water, sugar, egg yolks. And the egg yolks have, among other things, a lot of cholesterol, which is another form of fat. And we're going to talk in the future about what fat is. There's some sugar from corn syrup. There's corn syrup, which is just sugar from corn. All right. And then all of these various spices that are in here. Okay. Now, so when you eat a Big Mac, what does it look like from the biochemical perspective? Okay, 7.6 ounces, of which about half is water. So if you put a Big Mac into a freeze dryer, it would shrink down to something about half of it. All right. And the most abundant thing in the Big Mac is the sugar, the carbohydrates. And why is that? Well, the sugar is mostly from the bun, but then we saw there's actually a fair amount of sugar in the sauce also that's on it. And then there is about a little less than 1 ounce of protein in there. So it is, in fact, a pretty complete diet. It's got your 3 major groups, fats, sugars, and protein. It's enriched, so it's got a lot of vitamins in it. And then the meat itself, of course, has a lot of vitamins in it too. Now, the reason you shouldn't eat them every day, though, is because of this. So, of the calories in the Big Mac, most of the calories are in the fat. There's 310 calories in the fat, 180 in the carbohydrate, and only 100 in the protein. So, in a way that's surprising, because if we go back, this is 2.7, there's only 1.2 ounces of fat. And yet when we look to where the calories come from, the calories come from the fat. And where's the fat? You know, so is it the bun? No. Is it the meat? A little bit. Most of it is the sauce. You know, the calories, and this is true of so many of the things we eat. You know, if you have a salad, those are good for you, but boy, if you put all that salad dressing on it, most of the calories is from fat. All right, and so this is why, you know, you shouldn't eat just fast food all the time. It's because you're eating a diet in which is more than 50% fat. All right, and that creates all sorts of physiological challenges to your body, and we're going to go through that a little bit in the future too. All right. Now, this brings up the question, though, just what is a calorie anyway? All right. We're all calorie conscious, but what does that word mean? Okay, so it is a measure of energy. And it really is a measure that you can actually get an intuitive sense of. The best way to think about it, and this is a very valid way for biological processes, is to think of it as an amount of heat. because heat is a form of energy, and we actually use much of the food we eat to generate heat. All right, so a calorie will raise a liter of water, it's about a quart of water, by 1 degree centigrade. All right, so 1 calorie in terms of food terms is equal to 1,000 calories to a biochemist. Now, I won't expect you to memorize that, but it's often a confusion if you go and look at chemistry books versus nutrition books, because they actually define what a calorie is in slightly different ways. So often we think of a person fundamentally needing about 2,000 calories a day. Probably 2,500 is a little more accurate. But for simplicity's sake, let's say that the typical human requirement is to eat food that contains 2,000 calories. So, how much energy is there in 2,000 calories? Well, so to kind of put it in some perspective, so if you wanted to get 2,000 calories and you're just going to eat nothing but rice, if you took a standard kind of 1 pound bag of rice and you cook it, this is the dry rice, 1.1 pounds of dry rice, and you cook it into a pot of rice, and that's the only thing you eat in the day, you'll get 2,000 calories. You'll eventually die from pellagra, all right, but for the purposes of our experiment. Your body has in it about 100 pounds of water, roughly. All right. And so we can take this number here and say that every calorie will raise a liter of water by 1 degree centigrade. And we see that if you took that pound of rice and used all the energy in it just to heat your body temperature would go up by 72 degrees, from 98.6 to 160. You would have quite a fever. All right. So, as we're all sitting in this room, in fact, we're generating quite a bit of heat. So humans run at a kind of metabolic rate of essentially about the same as a 100-watt light bulb. And you know, that kind of intuitively makes sense too. You know that if you get a room with a lot of people in it, the room can get very warm. And so picture of it, you know, there are about 40 of us in here. If we had 40 100-watt light bulbs growing, that would generate a lot of heat. And that's what your body is doing kind of 24 hours a day. You know, goes up and down a little bit. So a lot of the food we eat goes into heat, but not nearly all of it. I mean, in fact, it's probably about in the order of 60%, let's say, of the food we eat does not go into heat, at least not directly. So where does that go? Well, somehow this is taking our food and converting it to energy. And that's a kind of mystical, magical term. But it was very much the focus of my own research for many years. And it'll take a good hour to explain it, so that's what we'll do next time. Okay, so we'll stop there for today. Okay, so questions about any of this today? Cindy.
What about these new wonderful new grains? Quinoa, millet, or all those things, are they all like in the same category? Or, some are berries, they say, they are not.
Yeah, so one way they differ is most grains are mostly carbohydrates because they're mostly stored starch. A few of those have a lot more protein in it. I think quinoa especially, I think is a very high protein food instead of a high starch. So the bottom line, as with anything, any of these nutritional questions, is what's the best bet? And the best bet is to have a mix of them. So is quinoa particularly good? Well, if you were a 100% quinoa diet, no, probably not. You'd have deficiency in other things. But it's a good way to get protein. It's a good non-animal way to get protein in your diet. If you looked at the exact kind of protein, I mentioned there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. Different proteins have different mixtures of these 20, and most of them turn out to be deficient in some of the 20. So pure quinoa would probably not be good for you. All right. So yes, some of these are good. Be suspicious of all miracle claims. Right. Okay.
So you mentioned that there's not much sugar inside a cell.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of sugar in your cell?
Okay, so this two roles. So first of all, there is a structural role. So there are sugars that are often used to coat proteins, and that is two functions. One, they seem to protect the proteins from being degraded, attacked. The proteins are more stable if they have sugar molecules on the outside. And then the second one is sometimes they're used sort of like addresses, signals. Certain sugars are used, for example, within the cell. You put a certain type of sugar on a protein, that signals the machinery to say, take me to the mitochondrion. I'm a mitochondrial enzyme, or I'm a vacuolar enzyme. But the second major role is they are the central players in the energy metabolism. It's just that we don't accumulate high levels, and we try to keep the level high enough to provide the energy we need from minute to minute without being too elevated. And of course, this is the whole insulin diabetes conundrum, where we have a very elaborate system to maintain these sugar levels at the right level. And because it's elaborate, it can go awry at different points, and that's why diabetes is a major health problem. Okay, Todd?
What's the role in terms of energy percentage? 80% from the main grains.
Mm-hmm.
But what about potatoes and root plants?
Well, so they're really important, but they're just in terms of kind of world population, they're not that big a percent. Potatoes are clearly very important, but if you just look at sort of agricultural output, they're not that widely used. And the major reason is because they're so wet. See, the great virtue of these grains is that's really concentrated energy. So a pound of potatoes versus a pound of rice, the rice is going to probably have 4 or 5 times more energy simply because of all the water in the potato. So it's more local, and they don't ship potatoes, very far, across ocean, but grains can go anywhere.
The second question is, the Big Mac has hydrogenated soybean oil. Are there any trans fats in that?
Presumably none. Right. Yeah. So I'll talk about that a little bit when we. So the lipids, what Todd's referring to is the lipids. In fact, I'll just briefly touch on this here. So notice that this molecule has all the hydrogens that you could place on there. Many types of lipids that are made, especially by plants, will be missing some of these hydrogens. So instead of 2 hydrogens here, you'll have a double bond to the carbon. You still have the rule of 4. The carbon's got to have 4 electrons. But it will replace one of the hydrogens by forming a second bond with its neighbor. All right. There are reasons nutritionally and just in terms of food processing where you sometimes want these to be fully hydrogenated like that. And so if you start out with plant oils that are missing the hydrogens, you can chemically add the hydrogens back. That's hydrogenation of lipids. However, when that happens, if it's done incorrectly, you can end up making hydrogenated molecules that are different from any that naturally occur. And these are what trans fats are. And they're found to be associated with certain kind of cardiovascular diseases. And so many years ago now, a real movement to ban trans fats. And they've pretty much been eliminated from American diets. And all of these hydrogenation reactions now produce virtually no trans fats.